how all that works. But okay, so today we are shifting to talking about adolescence. So we've made it through all of childhood at this point. Adolescence is usually defined as like between 12 and 19. One of the first things we're going to talk about, though, is puberty. And puberty is getting actually earlier, like pretty much every generation. So there are some people that even define adolescence at this point as like 9 to 19. But we're going to say 12 to 19 for purposes of this class, because that's kind of traditionally been the cutoff. So like I said, first thing we're going to talk about is puberty. Lots of dramatic changes that happen during this time due to mostly, influence of hormones that are being produced at a much higher rate during this time than they are during childhood or during any other period in the lifespan. So they affect everything from physical growth, not just size, but also proportions of different parts of the body. They affect, visual appearance, things like hair, voice, and they also affect the brain pretty profoundly, all these hormonal changes that are going on, which impacts decision-making and cognition. One of the main effects that we'll see that happens from all this is that adolescents tend to engage in many risky behaviors. A lot of you might currently be in adolescence or have just barely left that, so you might have some experience either yourself or watching friends make some pretty stupid decisions. I made lots of dumb decisions when I was in this age group, so it's pretty universal. But there are also some improvements in reasoning abilities and scientific understanding and just cognition overall, again, just due to gradual growth of the brain, all of that. So, all right, so to start, let's talk quite a bit here about puberty, some of the changes that are happening. So again, most of the changes that are happening during puberty are due to changes in hormones. Some of the biggest ones are growth hormone. So growth hormone, as the name implies, just causes the body to grow overall. There's another one called thyroxine that contributes, that kind of helps. It's like a partner to growth hormone that helps with just that physical growth spurt, basically. Thyroxine, Thyroxine. So thyro and Xine. And then in addition to those growth hormones, there is a drastic increase in sex hormones. So sex hormones are mostly going to be like testosterone for cisgendered boys and estrogen for cisgendered females. So those sex hormones, they exist in both genders. It's just that there's more testosterone in boys. They have a little bit of estrogen, but more testosterone. And then for girls, it's the opposite. And those sex hormones basically contribute to the visible differences that we see during adolescence between, again, cisgender boys and cisgender girls. So the androgens, that would be like testosterone, that contributes to growth of hair all over throughout the body. It also causes like the penis and the testicles to grow larger. It also contributes to like muscle growth. So testosterone helps the body basically like hold in protein and pack on more muscle. It also helps like deepen the voice basically and kind of broaden the shoulders. So the testosterone contributes pretty significantly to like the changes in body growth that we see in boys during this time. Estrogen, on the other hand, it stimulates the growth of breasts. It stimulates like widening of the hips, maturation of the vagina, the uterus, all the reproductive organs, all of that is happening due to these hormonal changes. And then it also will trigger the menstrual cycle. So for girls, kind of the marker of puberty is basically the first period, which happens, sometime usually between like 10, 13 is when the average girl will have her first menstrual cycle. For boys, there's not quite as much of a drastic marker of like on this day you've started puberty. It's a little bit more gradual, but there are signs like deepening of the voice, broadening of the shoulders, muscle growth, all of that. Sex hormones also help contribute to bone density, so they help strengthen the bones. We've talked a little bit about how throughout childhood, they start out with bones that are very flexible, and then they kind of harden, and then during adolescence, you get kind of the final stage of that, where the bones are becoming as dense as they will be for basically the rest of the lifetime. Just some terminology you should be familiar with. So primary sexual characteristics, you might hear that term. Primary sexual characteristics are basically like a genitalia, so whether you have a penis or a vagina, and the maturation of those reproductive organs. And then secondary sexual characteristics are the things that most people can see from the outside. So like visible changes, like hair growth, deepening of the voice, muscle changes, all of that. So those are just some terms you might be familiar with. I can't remember. I might use those throughout the lecture, or definitely later when we do our discussion. One of the other things about puberty is that there's pretty large individual differences in the timing of it. So some people may start puberty quite a bit earlier than others or later, and that can actually have a lot of effects on like social acceptance and peer interactions. We might come back to this in a little more detail when we get into like social and emotional, but just, you know, to kind of preface it a little bit. In general, girls that start puberty earlier tend to have like more self-esteem issues. They tend to be more rejected by their peers compared to girls that are more like late bloomers that start puberty a little bit later. For boys, it's the opposite generally. So boys who are like early bloomers who start puberty early, they tend to, you know, pack on muscle earlier and grow like taller, and they're more accepted by their peers, more popular, compared to boys that are like late bloomers that, you know, start a little bit later. They often are perceived as like weak. So the onset of puberty can affect a lot of like social dynamics in a person's life. And then, like I said, also the age of puberty onset has been decreasing pretty gradually and steadily since the 1900s. So it seems like every generation, the age of puberty goes down. There's a couple reasons for that. Some of them are like positive. So one of the things that contributes to the start of puberty is just like overall nutritional health. And in general, like if you have more fat packed on and you're getting more like nutrition, then you're going to start puberty earlier. So in the past, puberty might have been delayed because there were a lot of people who didn't have good access to nutrition. They were basically malnourished, and malnourishment can delay the start of puberty. So that's probably one of the main driving factors in that, but there might be other things, you know, going on environmental as well. Like I said, we'll come back to talk quite a bit about puberty, the like social and emotional impacts whenever we talk about that part of development next Tuesday. So for now, just the physical developments. Another thing that's happening during adolescence, again, partially driven by all those hormonal changes, are developments in the brain. One of the main things to keep in mind during adolescence, the executive control network, which is mostly the prefrontal cortex, is still underdeveloped. So you don't get full like myelination and connectivity in that prefrontal cortex until young adulthood, which is like in early 20s. But even though that system is not fully developed, we'll talk in a minute about like cognitive things. Teenagers often tend to not be introspective in a way. They don't really realize that they're not fully developed. They kind of have this feeling that like they know everything basically. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. There's also some changes in an area of the brain called the reward network. So the reward network, as the name implies, is really important for our feelings of like pleasure and reward whenever we engage in a positive activity or something that we enjoy. So this part of the brain would be really active if you're like spending time with your friends or if you're engaged in a hobby you like. Very active during like sex, for example. It's activated by certain drugs, mostly stimulants, things like cocaine will stimulate this reward network. One of the interesting things that happens with this network in adolescence is that it is very sensitive to positive reward, and it is essentially ignoring risk. So as you become an adult, that'll kind of shift to where this network will take risk into account more heavily. But as a teenager and adolescence, risk is basically like completely ignored. So that leads to all kinds of risky behaviors because essentially teenagers are not weighing the risk whenever they're making certain decisions. There's some people who theorize that that's actually like an evolutionary thing that we evolved as a benefit, that basically having the network that way during adolescence kind of drives you to make decisions that help you, kind of separate from your family, make your own path, take risks to get, started on a life that's going to be highly rewarding. So that might have positive impacts, but it just kind of depends on how that network is applied, what environment it's being put into, basically. You're having synaptic pruning in some areas. We talked a little bit about synaptic pruning in toddlerhood, and most of the pruning goes on kind of early in childhood, but there is also some pruning going on here. Some of that is happening in that reward network, but then you have expansion in other areas. So the prefrontal cortex, even though it's not fully developed, it's continuing to grow, it's continuing to make more connections that will be finalized basically by the end of adolescence into young adulthood. So overall, lots of changes in the brain. Again, something we'll probably come back to when we talk about social and emotional development. I'll mention again that idea of like risk in social situations. Another major change that's taking place during adolescence are shifts in the sleep-wake cycle. It's something we probably have all experienced. So in general, adolescents need more sleep overall than adults do. So in teenage years, it's really recommended to be getting like up to 10 hours of sleep a night, whereas the adult recommendation is going to be more like 8 hours. Changes in the brain and hormones often will shift the teenager's sleep-wake cycle later. So teenagers will basically be more sensitive to like daylight and certain things that are going on that make them want to go to sleep later and then also sleep later. And our society isn't really set up to accommodate that. You know, things like school and work often start really early in the morning when basically no teenager's brain is set up to wake up that early. So that can cause all kinds of issues with things like executive function. So, you know, lots of adolescents have an overall lack of sleep, so they have a hard time with self-regulation, emotional regulation. It also can reduce academic achievement. So it's been shown that teenagers who are not getting enough sleep tend to do more poorly in school compared to those who are allowed to sleep more. It also tends to increase rates of anxiety and depression, and also high-risk behaviors, things like, you know, making poor decisions about drug use and sex and, you know, car accidents, things like that go up quite a bit whenever teenagers are deprived of sleep. So there's been kind of a movement. I know like when I was in high school, it tended to start quite a bit earlier than high school does for my son now. So there's been a movement to kind of shift like the start time for school later in the day so that teenagers have more opportunity to actually get a full night of sleep. So some of the nutritional issues that are going on in adolescence, one of the big ones is that teenagers, first of all, they need more calories in general than in childhood or than they will in adulthood. Part of that is due to just a lot of the metabolic changes that, again, is being driven by like that growth hormone is stimulating growth, and that requires a lot of extra calories. But teenagers, more than any other age group, are likely to engage in behaviors where they're not getting adequate nutrition. They're more likely than any other age group to skip breakfast, partially because of all the things I was just talking about. If you're waking up late, you know, you don't even want to be awake in the first place, you're probably not going to want to eat that early in the morning. So teenagers often will skip breakfast. They're also more likely than any other age group to like be eating, you know, just while they're doing things out kind of on the go and not taking time to like stop and have a full meal. And they also are more likely than any other age group to eat like empty calories, you know, have like sodas and junk food, things like that. So because of that, vitamin deficiencies, particularly iron deficiencies, are fairly common in adolescence, particularly for girls. Girls tend to need more iron because they lose that iron during their menses, during their period. And so if they're not getting proper nutrition, then they can have iron deficiencies that cause all kinds of issues. In addition to all of that, adolescents are also the group that is most at risk for developing an eating disorder. So things like anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. And so if you kind of combine all that, they need more calories than everyone else. They have really bad diets, and then they're also likely to develop an eating disorder. Then that can lead to all kinds of nutritional issues during adolescence. Some other common health issues that come up during this time are from risky behaviors, so engaging in things that are high risk, That includes things like sexual behaviors. So obviously puberty, one of the things that it also triggers is an increased sex drive, and that leads to pretty high rates of sexual activity in adolescence. So these numbers that I have here were taken from, I want to say like 2015, and I would guess that they've probably gone down slightly since then, especially if we take COVID into account. Probably during COVID years there was a lot less opportunity to be sexually active, so these numbers might be a little bit lower than what's here. But in general, about 70% of teens will have had sex by the time they graduate high school by age 19. So a huge majority of teens are sexually active. Let's see, 14% of them do not use contraception consistently. So 14% of that 70% that's sexually active are not using any contraception, which obviously puts them at risk of STDs, STIs, and teenage pregnancies, which we'll talk about more in just a second. Part of the reason of this too is that there's obviously lots of mixed messaging from like media, movies, and TV shows and things like that don't necessarily do a great job of showing proper use of contraception or showing like the potential risks or consequences of engaging in unprotected sex. So 20% of those who are sexually active will get some sort of STI or STD by the time that they hit that age of 19. And about 750,000 teens become pregnant every year from engaging in this sexual behavior. About 1 in 4 of those pregnancies will end in an abortion. So a lot of teenagers opt not to follow through with it. In general, there's certain factors that make people more at risk for teenage pregnancy. Generally, girls who are in a lower socioeconomic status, those who are that come from divorced families are more likely to have teenage pregnancies. Girls that have poor school achievement or that use alcohol or drugs are also more likely to become pregnant as a teenager. And then there's all kinds of consequences that can come from that. So teen mothers are less likely to graduate high school. They're less likely to go on and get secondary education. They're more likely to have a second unwanted pregnancy. Can't remember the percentage off the top of my head, but there's a pretty large percentage of girls that get pregnant as a teenager and then go on to have a second unplanned pregnancy. So lots of potential consequences, obviously, from sexual behavior. I will say it might be obvious because I've talked about my son. My son's 15, and if you guys just do the math, I mean, I guess you guys don't know how old I am, but I was 18 when I got pregnant and 19 when I had him, and I'm still married to my husband and didn't have a second kid and went on to get a PhD. So it's not inevitable, obviously, that a teenage pregnancy will cause all those issues, but in a lot of cases, just statistically speaking, it does. Some of the things that can help mitigate those risks: one is having access to good health care. Having a family that's really supportive. So if you have, basically grandparents of the child that are willing to step in and help, if the father sticks around or at least contributes financially, all those things can help mitigate some of those negative outcomes from teenage pregnancy. Okay, so sexual behavior is one of the risky things that's going on, contributing to all kinds of health issues. And again, all that relates back to those areas of the brain. Teenagers are very focused on the reward and the things that feel good and kind of ignoring all these risks. Even though you guys have probably learned all of this, it's something that most adolescents tend to just ignore. In addition to sexual behaviors, adolescence is a time when most people are likely to engage in substance use. So using either drugs or alcohol. Again, a lot of statistics here. So 50% of teenagers have used at least one drug. So again, this is a poll, I think, from kind of around the same time, 2015 to 2017. And again, probably I would guess these numbers have gone down slightly since then. But from this survey, 50% of teenagers used at least one drug in the past year at the time that they did this survey. Let's see, 62% have abused alcohol. So that's the most common drug, obviously, that teenagers typically use. By the end of high school, about 6% of adolescents smoke cigarettes regularly. 17% report having recent heavy drinking, so getting to the point of being drunk, basically. By the end of high school, 21% have used marijuana, and 21% have used more highly addictive drugs, things like amphetamines, heroin, ecstasy, etc. So pretty high percentage. I mean, that's almost a quarter of teenagers who are using, harder drugs by the time that they graduate from high school. I will say, maybe contrary to what media would have you believe, most teenagers that use drugs do not become addicted. So it's actually fairly common for a teenager to just experiment with something socially and then move on and never really use it again. But if you use drugs or alcohol in adolescence, your chance of being addicted goes up pretty significantly. So part of that has to do with the fact that the brain is still not fully developed. So if you're using drugs when your brain isn't fully developed, it's more likely to have very significant impacts on the structure of the brain, the wiring of the brain, that can lead to addiction later on. So obviously not everyone's going to become addicted, but it does pretty drastically increase the risk of addiction. Okay, any questions so far about kind of physical health things? Again, we might kind of reiterate some of these issues because there's a lot of combination between physical stuff going on and social and emotional, because the hormones and the puberty and all the sex and all this is a social thing, but it's also impacting the physical health. So we'll probably talk a little bit more about these topics on Tuesday, just from a slightly different perspective. All right, so in addition to all of these physical changes, both the growth and health issues that's going on, there are also some developments in cognition. So during adolescence is when people will enter the very last stage of Piaget's stages of cognitive development, and the last stage is formal operational. And I should actually back up and say that not everyone will actually reach this stage of cognition. So some people kind of end up stuck in that concrete operational stage, and they are not able to effectively do all the things that I'm about to list off, or at least not consistently. So one of the skills that adolescents develop is the ability to use hypothetical and deductive reasoning. So a lot of this comes from very formal education, from taking science classes, learning about the scientific method. That will contribute pretty significantly to these abilities. So deductive or hypothetical reasoning is basically just the ability to problem solve by developing a hypothesis and then testing that hypothesis to see if it is true or not. It's also the ability to consider multiple variables at the same time to try to figure out which variables are causing, the cause and effect order, basically. During adolescence, most will also develop propositional thought, which is the ability to kind of reason and argue verbally. So to take an abstract verbal argument and break it down and understand it, even if it's not something that's concrete or based in the real world. So their abstract reasoning goes up quite a bit. But then, like I said, it may not be universal, so there's quite a bit of evidence that some people do not ever actually fully reach this stage. They kind of remain stuck in that concrete operational stage of thinking. And then some other cognitive developments. So some of these are related to Piaget, but so scientific reasoning, I already talked about that a little bit. But in addition to, considering multiple variables, teenagers are also able to take a theory and evaluate it based on its evidence, try to judge if it's a good theory or not. There are, some of these are improvements, some of them are also limitations. So one limitation that develops during adolescence is something called self-focusing. There's another name for it that I was trying to think of earlier that's kind of a new name, but it's basically this idea that kind of you're the star of the movie, or the whole world revolves around you and everyone else is just side characters or NPCs or whatever. So teenagers tend to have this idea that everything that's happening to them is the most important thing in the world. It's a very common kind of belief that adolescents develop that will often kind of shake off or go away in young adulthood or middle adulthood. Kind of related to that, teenagers also often develop this sort of idealistic way of thinking. So during adolescence, they're often being exposed to challenging thoughts, things like political arguments, religious beliefs, etc. And often during adolescence, they will take this very idealistic view of those complex topics, and tend to kind of have an attitude that they know more than adult figures in their life. In addition to that, they're very focused on immediate rewards. So that kind of relates back to what I was talking about earlier with brain developments. So because of the way that that reward network is shifting, adolescents often have a hard time thinking long-term. So they may forego a long-term reward if they can have an immediate reward instead. During adolescence, you also sometimes start to see some gender differences in different cognitive abilities. The most strongly supported gender difference when it comes to cognition is that males tend to be better at spatial reasoning tasks, and females tend to be better at verbal tasks than males are. So there is, though, evidence that a lot of that is due to societal factors and training and not something that's biologically ingrained. So especially for spatial factors, so spatial tasks, for example, some of the ways they measure it, at least in a laboratory, I should have put pictures or something here, but they'll have an image of imagine a Tetris shape or something, just some kind of random shaped object, and they'll show it at one angle, and then they'll show 4 options of an object that kind of looks similar, but it's been rotated in different directions or whatever, and you have to find the one that's the same, but that has just been rotated. There's another one where they have a 2-dimensional drawing of kind of imagine if you had imagine a kind of complex box that you unfold, and you can see all the perforation or whatever, right? So you have that unfolded as a 2-dimensional thing, and in the image there will be arrows. I guess I could maybe draw it. That might be easier. I'll do a really simple one, just because. So let's say you had a box unfolded like this, and you could fold it here to make a box, right? The test would be let's say there's an arrow here and an arrow here. Imagine you folded up the box. Would those line up? Yes or no? In this case, they would not, because those would both be at the top of the box. But if I put the arrows here and I fold that up, then those would line up, right? Does that make sense? So they have images like that, except a lot of times they're more complex. It's not just a flat box. It's a more complex 3-dimensional shape that will fold up. And they just ask, will these line up, yes or no? So those kind of spatial manipulation tasks, males tend to be better at them than females are. But there's a really interesting study, kind of a follow-up to this, where they kind of hypothesized that, again, this is all societal factors. So if you think of the kinds of toys and things that boys typically, stereotypically play with as a kid versus what girls play with as a kid, boys often get things like Lego sets, for example. Boys are also more likely to play video games as a kid than girls are, especially historically. I know when I was a kid, I have 2 older brothers. They had tubs and buckets of Legos that I was not allowed to touch because I'm their annoying little sister, and my parents would never buy me Legos. It made me super angry. And they had the PlayStation in their room, and I had to ask them permission to go play it, so I barely ever got to play it, right? So that's pretty typical for my generation. Your generation maybe is, your parents hopefully are a little more open than that. But so you can imagine if a boy spends all his childhood playing with Legos, which are very spatial, or playing certain video games, you're navigating through a map, or there's lots of video games that are puzzle based where you have to manipulate things spatially, right? Then that's probably going to improve spatial abilities. So there was a study where they basically tested that theory. So they took a group of male and female participants. They first did a test like this to test just baseline. They found the males did better than the females. But then they had them play a video game for 6 weeks that was some sort of spatial video game where they have to navigate a map or whatever. And then they tested them again at the end of those 6 weeks, and both the males and the females had improved, but the females improved really drastically to where they basically caught up with the males. So at the end of the study, the males and the females did equally well on the spatial task. So all that suggests that if there are gender differences in these cognitive areas, they're probably more due to training and societal factors rather than something that's biologically ingrained, and that they can be trained. Okay, any questions about physical and cognitive development in adolescence?